Ontario Place opened its gates almost 50 years ago. Its sprawling 155 acres includes prime waterfront real estate in the largest and most expensive city in Canada. Once a major draw for families, tourists, and Ontarians in general, it's been under revitalization for the better part of a decade. Now the Ford government has issued a call for redevelopment on the site. Joining us now to look at what might be included in that, from Redington Shores, Florida, via Skype, Virginia Ludi. She is the CEO of the Canadian National Exhibition. And here in our studio, Sevon Pelvetzian, CEO of Civic Action. Joe Cressy, Toronto City Councillor for Spadina-Fort York, the ward in which Ontario Place resides, and Suzanne Kavanagh, board member of the citizens group Waterfront for All, and a member of its Ontario Place for All steering committee. And it's great to have you three here in our studio. You two again, you for the first time.
Thank you.
Virginia Ludi, we should say for the record, you're the smartest one of us all, being down in Florida at this time of year, but we hasten to add you are working down there, so we thank you for taking time away from your responsibilities to be with us. Sheldon Osmond, our director, if you would, can you put this aerial shot of Ontario Place up so everybody can see what it looks like today? There's all the stuff, the West Island in the west, Trillium Park in the east, the Budweiser stage, which so many people have attended concerts there right in the middle. And here is some of what the government has posted on its website for Ontario Place's future. The areas available for development include the Ontario Place Islands, the mainland, the pods, and the Cinesphere. The government intends to maintain 7.5 acres of parkland. Residential uses for the site will not be considered, they say. Proposals for development of the land where the Budweiser stage is situated will not be considered, as it is subject to an existing lease. That's some of what's up, and of course it's taking ideas from the public and corporations right now as to what ought to go there in its place. Joe Cressy, to you first. What do you think of what the government's proposing?
Well, I think based on the criteria they set out, it's a tremendous missed opportunity. I mean, Ontario Place, 155 acres, in the heart of the waterfront, in the heart of Toronto, should be a place to create a new dynamic waterfront destination, to revitalize what was so great in the past at Ontario Place. Instead, what they've done here is open the door to the privatization of Ontario Place. There's no criteria saying the public must be able to access it. There's no criteria that says you must ensure that there's a connection to the water and our waterfront. And so it's a missed opportunity, and I'm hoping we're going to be able to change it.
Sevon, what's your view on what they've got? They haven't said what they want yet. They're taking proposals, but so far, what do you think?
Well, I have some history with this Ontario Place file. I had the privilege of being the leading civil servant during the revitalization of Ontario Place and was supporting the advisory group that gave recommendations on what should go on the site and what should not go on that site.
Was this the group headed by John Tory?
It sure was.
Okay.
It sure was. And the premier recommendation was that there not be a casino down at Ontario Place, and that was accepted by the government of the day. We have a new government. They may have new direction, and it would seem that's been added to the table. So lots of folks are looking at this site with great interest because it is a legacy site. It is the source of so many memories for so many Ontarians, but it is also a site based on landfill that has a lot of costs and considerations in its future redevelopment. That's part of the reason it hasn't happened so quickly and for so long, but it needs to happen because it's a special gem that needs to be polished.
We should just say they haven't said that they will put a casino there. They simply haven't said we forbid a casino there, right?
That's
we
right.
should
That's
be
right.
clear about that.
That's right. One of the few things that they said they're not interested in is residential, which was interestingly one of the recommendations that the panel did have a tolerance for. 10 to 15% of the site, and again, that's 155 acres, 96 of which is land, and the rest are water lots. So it's an interesting site for development, and there is not a silver bullet in making this happen.
Suzanne, your view on the approach so far?
Well, so far we were a little bit concerned about the expressions of interest because there's a lot of reading of tea leaves. We're not really sure what we're looking at. And so the flag for us was somewhere on that site of the 155 acres should be a park of 7.5 acres. So the flag for us in the community was, are you saying that we could then demolish Trillium Park? And Trillium Park was opened in June of 2017. And the concern that we also have is that in that park is part of William Davis Trail, and there are moments there in the trail celebrating the Indigenous communities. So that's a worry for us.
Because that is not explicitly protected.
So far, that's what we're seeing in the expressions of interest. It's not clear.
Virginia, I've purposely left you to the end. just because you are potentially a real partner with this venture, given that your Canadian National Exhibition is right beside it. So how are you approaching this file?
Well, that's correct. We have been right beside Ontario Place for the last 40 years that it's been operating. And we believe that any redevelopment of Ontario Place also has to take into consideration the property north of Ontario Place, which is Exhibition Place, and the surrounding communities. We feel that it needs to be an integrated planning approach. There needs to be consideration given to how those two properties connect, how you circulate pedestrians, and how you get people to these two sites. And I'm not sure that that's been articulated yet, but we're confident that as this process continues, that there'll be room to add those pieces to the call for expressions of interest.
Virginia, let me do a quick follow-up with you, which is to say both the minister responsible for this now, Michael Tobolo, and Jim Janu, who is the new head of Ontario Place, the new board chair, they have used words like disgraceful or shameful to describe the current condition of Ontario Place. Would you share that view?
Well, I've had an opportunity to spend a lot of time at Ontario Place just by virtue of our close proximity. And it is clear that the government has not been able to invest in the infrastructure. And so there is some decline in the site. However, I don't think that that is a reason to write off the entire site. I think that there are things that can be done quite easily and quickly to improve the experience and really try to get the Ontario Place site back up to what it once was.
Joe, disgraceful and shameful, in your view?
Well, I think we need to dispel some untruths here, or mistruths. Last year, Ontario Place had 1.4 million visitors. So Trillium Park, which Suzanne talked about, that was a $30 million investment by the previous government to create Trillium Park. The Cinesphere, it's been completely revitalized. In fact, the producer of your show here saw Purple Rain there this past Friday night. And so I have to tell you, this notion that Ontario Place is disgraceful and disgusting, 1.4 million Ontarians, about the same number of people who go to the CN Tower every year, might disagree. Now, that doesn't mean it's not perfect and set up for an upgrade and a revitalization. And so then it's a question of what's your vision? And so for those of us who believe in building an Ontario Place for all Ontarians, the vision has to start with accessibility and the waterfront. You want to build a dynamic waterfront destination. But if your interest here is simply leasing it off to the highest bidder, which I think the expressions of interest might result in, that's where we could end up seeing something truly disgraceful, like a mega mall or a casino or something of that sort.
Just humor me for a second.
Sure.
What would be so horrible about putting a casino there?
Well, here's the thing about a casino is 4 walls. It's a box. You can put it anywhere. Great cities around the world don't have casinos on their waterfront. In fact, what a casino does, it hemorrhages jobs from the local area. It's insular. It brings people in to look inward instead of outward. On the heart of the waterfront, you want people experiencing the waterfront. But most of all, casinos drive most of their economic benefit from what we call problematic gamblers, people who have gambling addictions. And the way you build a great economy is not off the backs of the most vulnerable. And that's what a casino does.
Okay, humor me some more here. Sev, the casino would not take up all 155 hectares, acres. I don't know what that is in hectares, but 155 acres, it would not cover the whole site. Presumably, it would be one small part of it. Why? I mean, virtually every single person I talk to, maybe save an exception of the premier, says a casino's a terrible idea. Why is it a terrible idea?
Well, I am not the gambling type, Steve. So for me, this is not how I want to spend my pastimes. And I think that's what a lot of folks are reacting to when they say, do we want a casino down at Ontario Place? There is such a unique geography to this place. I mean, when Vegas was created, it was a way to make usefulness out of the desert, right? That makes sense to put something like a bunch of casinos down there. But this new Trillium Park, which has 260-degree panoramic views of the city, unlike any other spot in it, is remarkable. Whether there is a benefit to gaming can be a question of its own right. Whether that's the site for gaming is something entirely different. There's no mistaking that the gaming industry brings in a ton of money to the provincial coffers. Last year, about $7.5 billion. So I certainly understand that a government that's focused on the bottom line wants to look at opportunities to bring in new revenue. But is this the place to do it? And is this the way to use that land? Because you really get to kick this can once every 100 years at best. Is this really what we want to do? Let's be really smart about it.
We did ask if Minister Tibollo wanted to come on the program and talk to all of you and the people of Ontario, and his office declined, but did put forward this statement. We'll put it up on the screen, Sheldon. You can share it with everybody. Under the previous Liberal government, Ontario Place fell into disrepair and has been underutilized. That's why we want to move forward as quickly as possible with a plan to create a world-class destination in Ontario. No decisions have been made at this time. We look forward to receiving new and innovative ideas as a part of this process. What's wrong with that? Sorry, I see you smiling already, so I'm inferring that you have a problem with that statement, Suzanne.
Well, part of it too is that they keep throwing these things out and there's really no meat on the bone. So we hear the word monorails and then nothing else. And then we hear casino is not off the table. So I'm worried that the language that they're using are a bit of a red herring. So if they keep saying casino is not off the table, then are we figuring, do we have to get together and say, we don't want a casino and here's why? And then coming from the right could be something else and say, ta-da, here it is. So we think that one of the things that we've been pushing through our group is to say, whether or not you want to call it public consultation, we think that it needs to be an open conversation around what is it that they want to do. So for us, you know, we talk about the waterfront, and I've moved to Toronto, so I'm hearing the stories of people saying I was born and raised here and I watched Ontario Place be born. But for me, when you take a look at the water's edge, I moved here and I came as close to the water as I could because I'm a kayaker. So I love the waterfront. But I'm thinking that whatever we do, we should be facing the waterfront, not turning our backs on it. So as Siobhan said, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It's a very momentous opportunity to get this right. So, and oftentimes, you know, we hear the comparison about Chicago, what a great city it is.
With a great waterfront.
With a great waterfront, we can do better because Millennium Park is not facing the water. Navy Pier, I think, is limited in its programming. And I think we've got a real opportunity to still use the open space system and bring in some privatization, but still keep it open.
Ontario Place, as the name suggests, is owned and operated by the province of Ontario. But the city has a role. And I wonder have you looked into whether or not there is, what the heritage status of Ontario Place is, in case you can use that act?
So as it relates to heritage, there's a statement of cultural heritage significance that the province has recognized, which somehow was deleted from the province's website just last week, I should note. But heritage is one piece. Here's the thing, and Virginia from CNE may want to touch on this, but Ontario Place, the province owned the bulk of the land, but not all of it. When it relates to part of the water lots that actually connect the land to the islands.
Let's bring this up. Sheldon, you want to bring the shot up? Remember that opening aerial shot? Why don't you bring that up and Joe can actually take us through this and show us specifically what he's talking about. Okay, Joe, there's the shot. Can you see it on the monitor there?
So as you look around the water that's connecting where the west entrance is, the east entrance is, the center entrance, that water lot, along with the bridges that are connecting it, that is owned by the City of Toronto. And so, I mean, this isn't some high-stakes game of poker where the city is going to say, you know, you can build a casino there, but we're not going to let people visit it because we're not going to grant them access. Rather, I think the tiered ownership demonstrates that this has to be a collaborative process, that the province can't go it alone because there are different levels of government involved here. And it speaks to Exhibition Place immediately north of it in the CNE, is that if we're going to create a truly dynamic space on the waterfront that you can actually get to with transit, that you can walk to when you get off the stop at Exhibition Place, we need to think about a precinct plan there. And so this is where I think the importance of getting this right from a 100-year decision-making point of view, it requires a more open and collaborative process than the one the province is doing now. It can't just be, we have an idea of what we're going to do, we'll pretend to call for other ideas, but at the end of the day, we're going to lease it to our pal. Rather, this should be open, it should be public, and it should be collaborative with the city.
Virginia, you want to build on that?
Well, I just think that, just echoing what Joe was saying, that connection to Exhibition Place is so critical. And when you look at those two bridges that are currently there now, they do not have the capacity to handle large crowds when you have them going to events at Live Nation. It is a long walk from Transit on the north end of Exhibition Place down to Ontario Place. So there are a lot of ways in which access and connectivity can be improved greatly. We hosted a winter festival at Ontario Place in the month of December. We had almost 150,000 people attend that festival at Ontario Place. But there were challenges for people to get there. Families coming with young children, having to walk quite a distance, public transit not dropping people right at the door. So I think that these are the things, these are the pieces that are the easier fixes. But when we start talking about casinos and we start talking about mega malls, I would suggest to you that this is an iconic waterfront property. Surely we can do better than that. Surely we can have more innovative ideas that will help to transform this piece of land and turn it into the destination that the province talks about, and create an opportunity for folks to come from out of town to come and visit Toronto, which would drive tourism dollars to Toronto, Ontario, but also to be a place where the community can come together and celebrate and enjoy all of those new elements. I mean, wouldn't it be great to walk at a Cinesphere and go and enjoy a nice meal at a nice restaurant at Ontario Place, or be able to go to some other attractions while you're there, to create, an attraction and a destination for not only the citizens of Toronto, but also from visitors who are coming from abroad.
Seth, you wanted to add?
There's two important factors that have to be considered as we talk about Ontario Place. One is, this is one of the most well-studied pieces in Ontario's history. So when I was working on the file, we had already 25 studies that had been done over 40 years. Policy selfies on the potential for this site. So it's been very well studied on what the art of the possible is. The science of the pragmatic is what is so unique to this site, right? So when it was built in 2 years, imagine that, between 1969 and 1971, all of that was built. No EAs, no environmental assessments at this time, right?
Incredible.
So a whole bunch of soil dumped into Lake Ontario, and this new place made. Residents were not living where they now live. Transit is not what it was not then, what it now was. The flavor of Ontario, the average age was something like 25. Now it's closer to 40, 41. So the entire fabric of this city and parts of this province have fundamentally changed, and the costs have gone up. When the government shuttered the doors in 2012, they estimated that to have kept it open for 5 more years, as it was, would have cost $100 million more.
Ouch.
Yeah. So we had to really look at what the best use of taxpayers' dollars will be. This is not a site that you can just arrive at and open up your canvas and start painting. There's civil infrastructure needs, there's soil remediation needs, there are contract needs with the Budweiser stage and others. So this is not an easy fix, but Ontarians are tired of the wait. They're ready to have it revitalized for a new era.
You mentioned there are myriad reports to call on here. Let's just talk about the John Tory report, which he did before, obviously, he was mayor of Toronto. What from that report do you think is worth salvaging?
There were 18 recommendations. Major themes. One, it's a public asset to protect the uniqueness of the public accessibility. When we developed Trillium Park, when that was opened, it was the first time it was ungated to the public in almost 50 years. So that was an important attribute. 2, the natural surroundings are pristine. Protect them. 3, need to animate it. Standing down there today, you would freeze your face off. It is extraordinarily cold, and it is not a high traffic zone necessarily in the winter. So the need to bring a whole bunch of different elements to animate it, and so that it could operationally be viable. Remember, this is not a cheap site. So it's not just putting 1 or 2 things down there. A Ferris wheel will not save Ontario Place. This is about animating with the right mix of partners, of pieces, and the report talked about the importance of partnerships as well. Millennium Park is a great example that's often used. Per acre, that park costs $20 million. By comparison, Sugar Beach, $7 million an acre, and the Trillium Park, $4 million an acre. Parks aren't cheap to build or to operate, but they are important pieces for the public.
Suzanne, this is a place that's hard to get to. If you were going to fix up Ontario Place, what would you do about public transit?
So that's one of the things we have been talking about, and we would welcome to see more accessibility through transit. So there is going to be the GO station at Exhibition Place, and then a lot of people along the waterfront have been talking about a waterfront LRT. Whether or not that's the answer, but we do need to improve it, because I agree with Virginia. Unless you're a walker or hiker walking over those bridges, especially as you mentioned this time of year, it's very bleak. And yesterday was wicked with that wind. So we do need to make it more accessible. So I think that transit would be one of the areas. And we're ready, because when you think about in '71 when this was opened, this was a very remote area. There was nothing around, and now there's what I call small towns that have grown up around Ontario Place. So I look at it and not only as a place for Ontarians, but also as a public park for the people who live just north in Liberty Village, in Fort York, in City Place. So it's changed over the years. So I think there is an appetite, and I think we've got enough critical mass to take a look at some more transit in that area.
Well, for example, we have heard rumblings about a monorail. Do you like that idea?
Well, frankly, the term monorail, it kind of sounds like something out of the Flintstones now. It's technology from a past era. It truly is. So what's the principle we're trying to solve, or what's the issue we're trying to resolve here? So first of all, transit, ensuring that Ontarians, whether you're coming from Kitchener or Hamilton or elsewhere, can access Ontario Place. Well, that's Regional Express Rail, and it's a new GO stop at Exhibition Place. For Torontonians, a city of 3 million people and growing, how do we make it easier for Torontonians to access Ontario Place? Well, that's the Waterfront West LRT, an already approved and designed light rail transit option that requires provincial funding to build.
But a low priority at the moment, it seems, for everybody.
Well, a high priority for the residents of this city, but a low priority for politicians who don't want to spend money. And then the final piece here, as it relates to access, has to do with how you get people from Exhibition Place to Ontario Place. And a monorail is a term, but it's not a solution. A solution has to be thinking about the integrated context between Exhibition Place and Ontario Place. And that means how people walk, how they cycle, how they use public transit. But one term, one idea isn't going to fix Ontario Place. It's been studied out the yin-yang. It's time for us to establish the principles once again and implement it.
Where exactly is the yin-yang, Joe? That has been studied in and out of. No, that's for another show. That's a different, thanks, yeah, different show. You know, I have heard some people say, admittedly connected to this government, that the place is in such a state of utter disrepair, they should just raze it, R-A-Z-E, and start from scratch. Virginia, what do you think of that idea?
Well, I think that there is certainly a need to improve and enhance the infrastructure at Ontario Place. There's no doubt about that. This infrastructure has been sitting in water for 40 plus years. In the last few years, there has not been a lot of money that has been put into Ontario Place from the perspective of upkeep and upgrading. I think they've done base maintenance, and they have put some money into certain areas of Ontario Place. However, I think there's a lot greater need for investment. However, I don't think that that's a reason to raise the to level Ontario Place. I think that there are elements of Ontario Place which are iconic. They're iconic to the brand of Ontario Place. You think about Cinesphere, you think about the pods. We all have fond memories of going and visiting those attractions. And is there a way that we could reinvent those and integrate those into a new development? So you maintain some of the historic past, but also you're able to paint a new picture for Ontario Place that will take it down into the next 50 to 100 years.
Let's share some public opinion polling, shall we hear? Forum Research did a poll recently, and here is some of what they found. Thank you, Sheldon, for bringing up these numbers. 81% of those surveyed said that Ontario Place is important to Toronto's waterfront. Fully 53% said it was very important. Those are pretty high numbers. 56% say they disapprove of a casino at Ontario Place. Only about a third, 30%, say they approve of the notion of a casino down there. The majority of Torontonians, 54%, say they would approve a Ferris wheel, something akin to the London Eye, being built at Ontario Place. 25% say they disapprove. 87% say it's important for the public to have easy access to the waterfront at Ontario Place, something you've all been talking about here. 60% saying it is very important. Suzanne, what jumps out at you of those numbers?
Well, the first comment I wanted to make was I was disappointed with the forum poll because they only talked to Torontonians. And for me, this is for all of Ontario. And so I think that when I talk to my friends outside the GTA, they say, you know, this is open for everybody. It's not just about, it's not Toronto's place. And I think, okay, fine. So I think that when you go back to, when they talked about the Ferris wheel and comparing it to the London Eye, well, I have probably more questions than I do answers about all of this, expressions of interest and so on. But when you think about the London Eye, my question would be, could we have something that iconic on the waterfront? You know, the comments about the stability of the soil, but also too, there's an airport just over yonder.
Right.
So
Billy Bishop.
I'm wondering about the flight path. I don't know.
No, well, it is known. You can,
Well, I do.
the London Eye would be 4 times bigger, apparently, than what you could build if safety provisions were going to be taken into account
Right.
at Ontario Place.
Right.
So it would be a small eye.
And,
If you're going to build an eye, it's a smaller eye, much smaller eye.
But also, too, you know, the Eye in London, look at where it's located. It's in the heart of the city.
Yeah.
And so their customers are literally walking by. And so I think, well, if we had the Ferris wheel at an Ontario Place, we'd need a lot more to go with it to get the people out there.
Sev, Ferris wheel, what do you think?
What is this fascination with the Ferris wheel?
They're fun. You don't like being on a Ferris wheel?
I enjoy a Ferris wheel as much as the next gal,
Okay.
but why is it that cities seem to think that they've made it when they get a Ferris wheel? I was in Kyiv in Ukraine early December. There is a Ferris wheel right downtown. Nobody was on it the whole time I was there. The challenge with a site like Ontario Place is everyone has these ideas of what might be fashionable for the era. At the height of its popularity, 3.3 million visitors came through Ontario Place. The year it was shuttered, 325,000 were coming through. Yeah. So it has got, whatever we put there has to try to stand the test of time. When it was created, this was long before the era of Canada's Wonderland, a wild water kingdom. It was where you went for outdoor recreation, amusement, and fun. I remember growing up in Cambridge, and the 5 kids, we'd get in the Buick station wagon, we would drive, we'd have a picnic, and we'd play in the water park and then drive home at the end of the night. But other things have filled that void. Whatever we do next needs to have a long-term lens. And I don't know what the Ferris wheel of 25 years from now is going to be, but I don't think it's the London Eye.
A Toronto Eye down there? What do you think?
Well, I think we have to start with the waterfront. And what struck out to me related to those polling results was that 9 in 10 Torontonians said access to the waterfront was key. You know, Toronto began as a waterfront city. It was our point of origin. And over a couple centuries, we lost the waterfront. Industrialization, a railroad, the elevated Gardiner Expressway all served to disconnect people from their waterfront.
People do not think of this city that we're in right now as a waterfront city. They just don't.
Well, and in the last 20 years, that's started to change. You know, in the last 20 years, Waterfront Toronto, an intergovernmental agency across 3 levels of government, has started to create the wave decks in the heart of downtown Toronto to bring Sherbourne Commons and Cherry Beach and others to the fore. And we are reclaiming our place as a waterfront city, and great cities have great waterfronts. And it's not that it's a nice to have to connect to the waterfront. In fact, when you build and invest in your waterfront, it attracts economic growth. It's not dissimilar from when you build great parks like Millennium Park we've talked about here in Chicago. It attracts tremendous tourism. And so we have to think about the connection to the waterfront as not only something that Torontonians and I think Ontarians want to see, but something that will stand the test of time for Ontarians in our city going forward.
Now, Virginia, I know you make your living sort of down there on the waterfront at the Canadian National Exhibition site, which is, after all, pretty much right on the water. But do you think of Toronto as a waterfront city?
I think there is a disconnect. I think that, people of Toronto are always looking for opportunities for ways in which they can connect with the lake. There are so many places in Toronto where you can walk up to the water's edge, but you can't touch the water. You can't dip your toe in the water. And so, if we were able to build that connection, I think that would be really a neat way of integrating the waterfront back into the city of Toronto. The other thing is, you know, the Ontario Place shoreline, if you have an opportunity to go down there in the wintertime, and probably I'm the only person who does these sorts of things because I'm down there all the time and have nothing else to do my day. But on the West Island, if you go and stand at the West Island when there is high winds and there's a good surf coming off that lake, what a show that is. You know, as the ice formations start to form at the West Island, and the waves come crashing in, it is an experience that not many of us take in. And I think that that's one of the gems of Ontario Place.
Suzanne, we know what you don't want to see there. What do you want to see there?
I think there's an opportunity, some of the things that we talked about before was to have an open park system so you can still have some privatization, so there is some revenue generation.
What does that mean, some privatization?
So what could happen is that if I'm a family going down to the waterfront, I could have a picnic right on the waterfront, or I could go into a restaurant and I could hang out there for the day. There could be some things, but not the entire thing.
Oh, so when you say some privatization, you just mean a restaurant.
It could be that, or some other pubs, or some other things.
Okay.
But I worry about doing one purpose-built for the entire site.
I see.
Because now what's going to happen is it won't be accessible, which is what everyone's talking about, to get to that waterfront.
I know the first answer you gave was, we don't want privatization down there, but by that, did you mean not even a restaurant?
No, I think what we need to see down there is, first of all, a deep connection to the waterfront through an active park system. But then we need to acknowledge that you need to animate what can be a very cold water's edge area year-round. And so whether that's through culture, which the previous government was working towards, or other innovation opportunities, there's a real chance here to have a year-round destination that connects to the water, that brings Ontarians pride. But what I don't want to see when I talk about privatization is some lease to a single partner to go out there and do a mega mall or a sports complex or a casino. We need to think about this as an entire district, and we need to be creative around that.
Now, a sports complex, I mean, obviously you're not talking about like a second Scotiabank Arena, but what if it was something somewhat smaller, big skating pad or something like that?
Listen, I know Doug Ford, and I've worked with Doug, and he tends to be a one-trick pony. So when he wanted to solve the Portlands on the waterfront, it was a Ferris wheel. When he wanted to solve economic development in downtown Toronto, it was a casino. And when he wanted to bring in a sports team, it was an NFL team with a 100-seat stadium.
100,000.
100,000, that's right. So thinking about sports, culture, innovation, parks, think about a variety of uses that's publicly accessible. That's what we need to see down there. What we don't need to see is a 100,000-seat NFL stadium or a casino or a mega mall or, and I got to be clear about this, a sweetheart deal for one of Doug Ford's donors. Because the last time he made a decision on the waterfront, which was in the Portlands on a site called the Hearn, that's exactly what he did. He sold it for a fraction of its value to a donor.
We know what you don't want there, Sev. What do you want down there?
I love where the recommendations of the panel landed in the advisory group that was done. I love the idea that there are a set of things so that when one, what part of the recommendations included considering, is there an academic facility, right, that could have part of its campus down there as an extension. Like the idea that there are different demographics using the site for different purposes made a ton of sense. And when we looked at some of the civil infrastructure needs of that site, they also made a ton of sense. Remember, all the sewage and hydro that needs to be installed, this has only ever been open 4 months of the year, right? And the population drive that was using it way back when is not the population drive that'll be using it to go forward. So you really do need to factor in a lot of different features for the right animation for year-round. The transit is not an insignificant issue. But I also hope, Steve, that we don't lose all the history. Nostalgia is a really important thread to hang on to. It doesn't knit you a future, but it's an important thread to hang on to. And whether that is the Cinesphere, whether that is the pods, whether that is maintaining that shoreline and that view, which, by the way, also serves as important flood protection, the new Trillium Park down there, that $30 million. Let's not use all the history and just hit Control-Alt-Delete in this site. It's too precious to do that too.
That's a good last word, a good place to leave this. I just remind everybody, Bill Davis did open this in 1971,
Yes.
but it was John Robarts who made the decision to build this place because Mr. Robarts thought that kids from lower income families ought to have a place to go in the summertime. And that was very much motivating him when he made the decision in 1969. Okay, thanks everybody for appearing on the program tonight. Virginia Ludy, the CEO of the Canadian National Exhibition, who was down there very sensibly in Florida, where we all ought to be. Joe Cressy is the Toronto City Councillor for Ward 10, Spadina, Fort York. Suzanne Kavanaugh, board member for Waterfront for All, and Sevon Pelvetsian, the CEO of Civic Action. Great to have all of you on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.